In the United States, socialism has for decades been a term thrown around to disparage and dismiss ideas and opponents on the left of the political spectrum. Until recently, witness Bernie Sanders' incredible run in the 2016 Democratic primary, and again right now. But that didn't come out of nowhere, and it isn't just about feeling the burn. Bhaskar Sunkara is the founding editor of Jacobin magazine. His new book explains how the once ridiculed set of ideas has been resuscitated in the U.S. The book is called The Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. And he joins us now on the line from New York, New York. Bhaskar, it's good to have you on our program again. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me again. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Not at all. How old were you, before we talk about the book, just a bit about you, how old were you when you first discovered the idea of socialism?
I was around 14 years old, and I just turned 30, so I've been a socialist for not only the majority of my adult life, but the majority of my life.
Don't take this the wrong way, but what kind of family produces a 14-year-old socialist?
Well, my parents were immigrants. We came to the U.S. I was the youngest of five, so I saw in my life how much of life was an accident of birth, how much public goods and other things I had access to living in a nice suburb in New York compared to my siblings who were born in Trinidad and Tobago, compared to my parents who were born abroad. And I really saw how much of life is dependent on having access to these great social goods. A lot of people from the Caribbean end up in Ontario, and I imagine that you'd be better off ending up in Ontario than ending up in New Jersey or New York, like a lot of the rest of us do in from the Caribbean. And I think the baseline socialist aspiration is a world in which life is not an accident of birth, in which we all have the opportunity to reach our creative potentials.
Having said that, I have seen you quoted in the past as having said, there was a certain randomness to the fact that I ended up being a socialist. And I wonder if you ever wonder, what if you'd stumbled on Milton Friedman first? Do you think I'd be talking to a very different person here?
Well, I think the baseline sensibility for my life experience was this social democratic sensibility, seeing the value of public goods, being an immigrant, all that entails in the U.S., especially when our Republican Party is quite right-wing and now increasingly xenophobic. It kind of leads you to the center or the center-left at the bare minimum. But I do think becoming a Marxist, becoming a more radical socialist, now that was a product of reading, and that was random. And I guess I'm lucky that I didn't stumble upon Ayn Rand or anything else. But I think I was predisposed to at least some sort of egalitarian vision of worldview.
We'll talk more about that vision in a moment. I do want to ask you about your magazine, though, because it is a pretty amazing success story, given that you were I gather, a 21-year-old undergrad student when you launched Jacobin magazine. There is sort of the curiosity of your naming it after a group which is remembered for a reign of terror during the French Revolution. So why that name?
Well, actually, the initial inspiration for the name came from the Black Jacobin, C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian journalist and scholar, who wrote a book about the Haitian uprising. And what really stuck to us about that name, the Black Jacobins and that sort of Jacobin tradition, was that these Enlightenment ideas, even though they were born in Europe just through an accident of history, belong to the whole world. And we want to see a world with liberty, with equality, with fraternity, with these Enlightenment ideals actually realized. Of course, we're democratic socialists. We don't, justify or support any act of political violence, small or large, or the reign of terror of the French Jacobins. But I would say that we talk often about the reign of terror of the French Jacobins, but we don't talk about the decades and decades and centuries of feudalism and oppression and the rule of the clergy and so on. I think we're living in a profoundly better world as a result of the French and American revolutions.
We should say to our viewers here in Canada that your numbers, and I'll share them now, 40,000 print subscribers, 1 million monthly online readers, more than $1 million a year in revenue. For people who don't know the magazine business, those are very, very strong numbers. And I wonder how you explain the success.
Our numbers are even better than that.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually have 50,000 now in print circulation. I would explain the success for two reasons. One is we were articulating a set of ideas to the left of mainstream liberalism. And in the U.S., our politics just ended at American liberalism, which isn't even social democracy. It just ended there. And we were told, all right, Barack Obama's far left because he's proposing some very minor expansions to the welfare state. and this is the road to serfdom, and Americans hate this. They're individualists. They love war and guns and so on. This was the mentality when Jacobin was starting, and we knew there was an audience for a set of ideas to the left of liberalism, and we cohered together this critique of liberalism and this critique of the right, and we put it under this democratic socialist umbrella. We revived traditions that were alive and well in the U.S. for many decades, but had disappeared in the years following the decline of the New Left in the 60s and 70s. And I think this was it. I think we had a sense that people were unhappy, that people wanted something better for themselves, and that people were starting to blame not just themselves in a very individualistic way, but they were starting to blame the corporate and political elite that runs this country for some of the problems facing them. We live in a country with infant mortality, with people who can't afford insulin pills, who have to go across the border. If you're living in Detroit, have to go across the border to Windsor, try to get insulin pills. This is life in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and people are getting fed up in it.
Let us just clarify something, though, that you are, because you referenced it in your last answer. You are not, if I can put it this way, a kind of a run-of-the-mill progressive or center-leftish kind of a guy. You are a socialist, and I wonder if you would help us understand what you see as the distinction between those two.
Well, I think socialists believe in two things. Now, one thing is we believe in these core necessities of life shouldn't be determined on your ability to pay. So we should take away these core necessities of life from the market, like health insurance, for instance, take it away from the market and guarantee it as a social right. So in other words, decommodify these social goods. But a very good, old school social democrat would say the same too. So what makes me a more radical socialist to the left of social democracy? I think that's the aspiration to take democracy and extend it from just the political realm into the economic realm. So if you think that democracy is a good thing in the ballot box once every couple years and you're voting, now, you should think that democracy is a good thing at the workplace, where we spend most of our waking hours. Why can't an ordinary worker have a say in elect their management? Why are we paid wages instead of getting paid dividends? Why can't we collectively run these industries? Because at all levels, workers of all types, be it white-collar, blue-collar workers, we actually know how to design, coordinate, and implement production. So even if we need a market to continue in the sphere of consumer goods, why not have democratic workplaces? And I think asking that radical question about ownership, asking that radical question about do we need capitalists, I think that's what makes you a radical, and that's what makes you a socialist.
Fair to call you a Marxist as well?
Yeah, I'm a Marxist. I'm a socialist because of my ethical values. I'm a Marxist because I think it's a framework that explains much that is pertinent in the world. I'm willing to tomorrow not be a Marxist. If I find that the framework is not explaining things in the world, then I'll be no longer a Marxist, but I'll be a socialist forever.
What does it mean to be a Marxist, this many years, 171 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto?
Well, I think to be a Marxist is to simply say that, material understanding of what's going on in society, this cleavage between the people who own the places in which goods and services are produced and the vast majority of people who have to work for them, who have to have nothing else but to sell our ability to work to those people. That explains a lot of the inequities in our society today. And from this inequity at the point of production flows a lot of other inequities. And I think being a Marxist just means you're using the framework of Marx to understand some things about the pace and development of production, to understand a few things about how society is functions and structures and so on. But it can't explain everything. Marxism can't explain the sex appeal of blue jeans. It can't explain facts about moral quandaries of life and so on. So it's not an all-encompassing science like it was treated in some of these countries in the old Eastern Bloc. And
how would you say that differs from, again, another movement we hear about these days, the intersectional left?
Well, I think that if you, by intersectional, people mean that there are many different forms of oppression, and we need to combat them all, and we might experience different forms of oppression. So a black woman in the United States might experience oppression on the basis of being woman, being black, and being a worker. Then, of course, it's just common sense, it's just descriptive. But I would say that we, on the socialist left, tend to place a bigger emphasis on this person's activity as a worker, because if you are working for a living, you're not only being oppressed, you actually have a point of leverage right there where you and your coworkers can band together. You could withhold your labor, you could go on strike, you could set forward demands, and you could actually fight against not only for better wages and benefits, but also fight against other forms of oppression. So I guess it's just a matter of emphasis, but I certainly am opposed to all forms of oppression.
No, I get that, but it felt, as I was reading the book, it seemed to me that you cared more about, or you were more focused, let me put it that way, on class as an area of concern as opposed to, say, gender or sexual orientation, and I wonder how come.
Well, one way to put it is this. If you actually want to fight against racism, and you actually want an anti-racism that goes deeper than just symbolic issues of representation and so on, then you have to be talking about the redistribution of power and resources to the most marginalized and exploited groups. But if you're talking about a redistribution of power and resources, you have to be talking about class. So I think it's not just an abstract thing where I just happen to pick team class and other people pick team race or so on. I actually think that by organizing the basis of our commonality of class oppression, we can build the types of coalitions that could actually more adequately fight against racism and sexism. So even an example of sexism, in a country like the United States where we don't even have universal health care, what does it mean if you're a woman and you're in a bad relationship, and it's hard enough to leave this bad relationship for all sorts of other reasons, but you're also tied to your spouse's employer-based health insurance policy. So if you leave your spouse, you also have to deal with not having health insurance. So in other words, if we win Medicare for all, you could talk about winning Medicare for all as a anti-sexist victory, even though it's not framed in those explicit terms often. And I think often if you're talking about these fights over power and wealth and redistributing power and resources, then you often are going to be able to achieve a great amount of outcomes that will diminish the amount of sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression in the world today.
Understood. Okay, you just talked about Medicare for all, which essentially we have in Canada and have for 50 plus years. Let me get a better understanding beyond that, what you as a democratic socialist would want to see happen. And for example, do you want to be nationalizing all the banks? Do you want to be nationalizing all the steel companies? Do you want to be nationalizing all the mining companies? Help us on that.
Well, I think that there are certain spheres of society in which you would actually want the state to run things in a planned, coordinated way with some democratic inputs from the population at large. So I think the health insurance industry is definitely one. The railways and certain forms of mass communication, definitely. So there are certain things that the state does well. I think healthcare, and mass administrating vaccines, in Cuba, hurricane evacuation, all my other complaints about the Cuban state, it does that pretty well compared to Haiti and Jamaica and other surrounding island nations. But when it comes to the production of forks or telephones or things like that, it seems kind of ridiculous to expect us to do this in a planned way and to expect that the state will be able to overcome both incentive problems and just the old price calculation problem. How do you respond to consumer feedback? How do you know what to produce and how much to produce? How do you weed out weak, inefficient products that people don't like and so on? So I think needs to be a role for the market. But I do wonder whether these firms have to be run by private capitalists. So I think socializing our finance, and it doesn't have to be one big state bank. It could be smaller local and regional banks too. Could be one way in which we could provide financing for firms that are operated on a cooperative basis, that are operated and owned by their employees. So instead of just having workers, we'll have worker owners. And I think if you are really committed to society in which we all can plant our flag and we all have a little bit of stake, a little bit of equity in society, and we're not just divided between ruled and rulers, then I think you should be in favor of this kind of evolution towards democratic ownership as well.
Now, this no doubt is not what you're talking about, but I can see the argument coming forward that, well, wait a second, we tried socialism in the Soviet Union. It was a massive disaster. They're still trying it in China. It's not really socialism anymore, and we certainly wouldn't want to live in that kind of a society. You mentioned some of the positive things about Cuba. My hunch is, on balance, most people who live in the province of Ontario or in the state of New York would rather live in one of those provinces or states than in Cuba. So what do you think American socialism would have to do differently in order that it not turn out as badly as some of those other examples I just gave?
Well, we're living in not the worst of all possible worlds. We're living in great countries that have huge degrees of civil liberties and freedoms and so on. But I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that a lot of the reasons why we live in decent places, and I would venture to say that at least at the standard of treating workers and citizens at a better level, that Canada is better off in the U.S. on a whole, is because of the struggles of radicals and socialists and the labor movement and so on. So we fought for and we won the 8-hour day. In Canada, Social Democrats and NDPers were a big part of winning and expanding your universal healthcare system. In the United States, we still have a host of reforms and regulations. We have basic rights to literacy and so on. So in other words, these aren't natural outcomes of capitalism. These were victories won by the workers' movement. I would imagine that most capitalists would rather we live in a kind of benign dictatorship like Singapore or something like that, where it's an authoritarian form of capitalism where there's not much dissent, there's not much pesky unions and so on, but there's still a base level of freedom. So I think we could say that the societies we live in today are in fact better and more free than the societies of the Eastern Bloc, for instance. But these are victories largely of the broad workers' movement, and many of socialists were involved in creating these societies.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump in with having said that, frequently when I hear this discussed in the United States, and for example, Bernie Sanders, he'll say things like, yeah, but they do it in Sweden this way, or they do it in Finland that way, or they do it in Denmark this way, and the outcomes are better, and it's more equal, and you've heard that argument numerous times, and yet we also hear that the sort of end of the road for socialism has come to many of the Scandinavian countries, which are now embracing more populist and conservative governments. So help us understand that, if you would.
Well, I think that in these countries, what you're seeing is the after effects of austerity. So since the 1970s and onward, these great Nordic model states, and by the way, these are states, in the case of Sweden, for instance, was administered by a socialist government, by democratic socialists in charge of a party that created a new regime of accumulation based on sectoral bargaining, based on having a really generous welfare state, based on having a real dynamic economy and be able to harness that towards social ends. We've seen that system roll back in the last 20, 30 years. And I think some of the rise of the right, and still a relative rise, the Social Democrats are still in charge in Sweden. There's a grand coalition of sorts in Finland, and the right, the far right, the true Finns, as they call themselves, are locked out. In Denmark, the Social Democrats in alliance with the left, the far left, are in power. In Norway, their welfare state is pretty much intact. I mean, and part of that is because they have vast oil reserves. But, I would say the narrative of retrenchment is sometimes overstated. These are still far better societies to live in than the ones we live in today as far as like life outcomes. If you're born in Buffalo, New York, you're going to have a different life outcome than if you're born in Westchester County, New York. That's a fact that we live with as New Yorkers and as Americans, but it's not the same in these other countries. So I would say that social democracy is still alive, but it has been rolled back. And that's why we need to not just win social democratic reform, we need to think about how do you make these reforms more durable. That's why I think we need to not only bring up the old social democratic questions of redistribution, we need to go back even further to the even older social democratic questions of redistribution of power and ownership.
Well, one of the guys who's been trying to do that for a very long time is Bernie Sanders. And he did extremely well when he ran against Hillary Clinton a few years ago for the Democratic presidential nomination. He's trying again. How's he doing in your view?
Well, it's a wide open race. Bernie Sanders is not ahead, but he's in the top flight of candidates. And the race is not cohering around one candidate. And he's looking pretty strong in Iowa. He has a great infrastructure in Iowa. We'll see how things are going in the other battleground states. But right now, it's anyone's race. And by anyone, I really mean it's Warren, Biden, or Sanders' race. So I'll take a 1 in 3 chance to have a Democratic Socialist be the nominee of a major party in the United States. That's not something I ever imagined I'd be able to see in my lifetime.
Do you think Elizabeth Warren's a Democratic Socialist?
No, she's not. She's not. She's a progressive liberal. And I think as terrible as I believe the Trump administration is, as terrible as a lot of these right-wing administrations have been in recent U.S. history, I think it's nice to have a progressive liberal in contention. But there's a huge difference between Warren and Sanders as far as how they approach their worldview, and also I think there's going to be a question of compromise. So I think you'll see this sometimes in Canada too, where often you'll have a major party moving to the left and adopting a certain platform, but the question is, will they be able to carry it out? Are they really committed to it compared to the grassroots and social movements pushing for these demands? And with Warren, I have more hesitation about her willingness to stick in the fight on certain issues, but there's no doubt that she's a far, far better candidate than we've come to expect from the Democratic field as a whole.
President Obama weighed in last week, and he didn't exactly give your side of the debate some oxygen. He said, even as we push the envelope and we are bold in our vision, we also have to be rooted in reality. The average American doesn't think we have to completely tear down the system and remake it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's perfectly right, and the average American doesn't think we need to tear down the system. We want to keep what's good in our society, what's good in our communities, but we also want to radically reform a lot of what's unjust. So I think he's pretending like people in the Democratic Party are demanding some sort of crazy year zero break, which is just not true. People are demanding health care. People are demanding an environmental program that will give a world for them to bequeath to their children and grandchildren. These are basic demands. So a lot of even the abstract things I talk about in my book, these questions of worker ownership and so on, this isn't on the table in the Democratic primary. What is on the table is a common sense agenda about banding together and fighting for our interests in a greater welfare state, greater security, and really making sure that our communities are not ravaged like they are right now by unemployment, by drugs, by all these other ills. And these are common sense things to fix. And I think a lot of the Democratic candidates at the forefront, Bernie Sanders, are coming up with solutions to these problems. So I think Obama is really misreading the situation within his own party. It's not an extremist current at all.
Well, I'm hoping you can explain this to me as well, because if you look at the polling in the United Kingdom, the Conservatives have now almost twice as many working-class voters as Labour does. And if you look at the just completed election here in Canada, there were many people who might define themselves as Democratic Socialists who voted for the Liberal Party as opposed to the New Democratic Party, for other reasons as well. Does it sometimes feel to you like the socialist movement is made up mostly of university graduates as opposed to the traditional working class who are supposed to be the backbone of the movement?
Well, I think I would actually question that data in the United Kingdom. I think if you look at people who are wage earners, so not just the old industrial working class, but people who in the service industries, nurses, teachers, and whatnot, you'll find that Labour has a polarity of those voters. So it is very important that Labour not abandon constituencies in the north of England, constituencies that might have voted for Leave but are still behind the core Labour agenda of defending the NHS and staying out of wars and really just have a cultural dislike for the Tories in Britain. In Canada, I mean, a lot of this can be explained by just tactical voting in a first-past-the-post system. But I do think that it is important that we expand the base of our appeals and that we make sure that we're speaking in a way and we're speaking to issues that are actually impacting ordinary working people. But working people doesn't just mean a certain type of old industrial worker, though obviously, we want to win them over too. It means people in logistics, nurses, teachers, people in the service industry, and so on. We need to get these people to think of themselves as not just atomized individuals, but people who can only get ahead if they band together with their sisters and brothers around them, join a union, take part in campaigns for a living wage, and so on.
Bhaskar, I have one last question for you, and I'm reminded of a former Prime Minister of Canada named Brian Mulroney, who always used to say, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. To that end, if the next election is between Donald Trump and, say, Joe Biden or Michael Bloomberg, who are you voting for?
I would vote for anyone against Donald Trump in a swing state. I'm not sure I would campaign for them, but I would definitely vote for anyone against Donald Trump, because the real question for us at that point would be, who would you rather be in opposition to? And I'd rather be in opposition to a Joe Biden, who has to sign on to a pretty center-left Democratic platform, than in opposition to Donald Trump and the really nasty forces of xenophobia and right populism that surround him.
Sounds like you agree with Mr. Mulroney, then. I will happily let people know that the name of your book is called The Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. We're so glad, Bhaskar Sunkara, you could spare some time for us here on TVO tonight. Thanks very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.